My parents handed me a life-altering surprise on my 16th birthday. I was living with my aunt, and I was not permitted to ask questions. Imagine this. I had just blown out the candles, hoping maybe for a little cake, some lukewarm presents, and the customary happy birthday hoopla. I got instead a notice of eviction from my own life. At first I thought it was a joke. No preface, no sugarcoating, just a straight, "Pack up, you're moving in with Aunt Margie." My parents had developed a horrible, twisted joke to get me going. Still, they weren't kidding. They required my room. Pregnant was Vanessa, my 22-year-old older sister, brilliant and always the family's star. I was the collateral damage. My parents had to set aside room for her, not even got a chance to object. It was like being summoned into a required HR conference and being informally told, "Hey, we're letting you go. By noon, clear your desk." I sat there shocked, the room whirling as my parents watched me waiting for my response. None stated, "This is hard for us too, Julian, but we love you." None. Sure, Vanessa was the golden kid. They were unaffected, as if throwing their only son aside was just another item on their to-do list for the day. No apologies, no explanations, no, "We'll talk about this later." She had been always like this. In their view, she was flawless. The valedictorian, the one who always carried home the medals, and now the one bringing a grandchild into the picture. Still, for me, this was a fresh low. They were throwing me out to provide place for her baby, and I found it unbelievable. Given the perfectly decent guest room upstairs, why not convert that? Mostly trying to understand, I questioned, but they only exchanged glances until my dad, Thomas, spoke out. "Ryan needs a place to stay too," he added. Ryan was Vanessa's boyfriend, a 25-year-old apartment renter across town. My head would not let me grasp it. He was moving in as well? He would be in the guest room. My room was to be the nursery. I thought of an old chair nobody wanted. They offered no choice at all. The choice was final, and debate had no place here. Packing felt strange. From my early years, that room had been mine. I could still see the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, the scrawls I had made on the desk when I felt nobody else was looking. When I needed a getaway from the commotion downstairs, it was my haven. My parents watched in the doorway as I hurriedly stuffed clothes, books, and whatever else I could collect into a suitcase. It was then being taken away from me as like it had never mattered. They merely observed. They showed no indication of regret or offer to help. At least "this isn't easy for us either," or even a slap on the back was half expected. They volunteered to drive me to Aunt Margie's, and at that time I was too numb to fight. No, they simply stood there, blank expressions as though they were waiting for me to clear their path so they could continue with their evening plans. Like she hadn't simply pushed me out of my house, my mom, Elaine, spoke on about some charity she was planning as if nothing had happened. My dad stayed fixed on the road, the quiet between us chilly and weighty. When we pulled up to Aunt Margie's house, there were no sincere goodbyes, no attempts at making me feel better. I watched out the window, the streetlights fading into lines of gold as we passed known places that suddenly felt like parts of a world I no longer belonged to. Just a quick, "Here we are. Take care," before they headed out without turning around. Already at the door, Aunt Margie took in the situation, her countenance a mixture of uncertainty and anxiety. She seemed to know, by just glancing at me, that something was quite wrong. She listened as I told her what had happened. Her eyes widened with incredulity and then narrowed with wrath. I felt a wave of comfort missing for years. She drew me into a hug. She said, already grabbing for her phone, "I can't believe this." She called someone I didn't know, but in a few seconds her voice changed from steady to explosive. Usually quiet, Aunt Margie never spoke up, but that evening she yelled loud enough for me to hear every word across the wall. "They said you were excited to come here for a while." The treachery sank like a boulder in my gut. They had lied to help themselves appear better, not merely thrown me out. Tears welling in her eyes, Aunt Margie apologized for not knowing the truth. That night, I lay in Aunt Margie's spare room, staring at the strange ceiling, processing everything. For the first time in what felt like eternity, I felt someone really meant it. I could stay as long as I wanted. It seemed like I was moving out of my whole life, not just from a room. Though relief was there was bitterness. I was not compelled to tiptoe around anyone or feel as though I was always attempting to show my value. Adjusting to life at Aunt Margie's was weird at first, like entering a parallel planet where people genuinely acknowledged you and cared about what you wanted. For the first time, I felt like maybe something better was beginning. The opposite of my parents, Aunt Margie, was all kindness and understanding. I staggered downstairs the first morning I moved in to discover a huge meal waiting for me. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, the stuff. When Aunt Margie noticed me, her face brightened up. She was in the kitchen humming a melody. "Good morning, Julienne." She grinned and said, "I thought you could use a proper breakfast." I stood there, feeling awkward looking at the table. Breakfast at home was, at best, grab-and-go behavior. If I came upon a stale bagel before leaving the house, I would be lucky. This was not like this. It was consideration. I sat down, fidgety pecking at the pancakes while Aunt Margie discussed her daily agenda. Having someone actually show concern for my welfare seemed strange. After breakfast, Aunt Margie left for work, leaving me alone in the house. I wasn't used to it, and it took all in me to not peek over my shoulder and anticipate my mom to rush in and remind me of all the things I had done wrong that day. There was something fresh in stillness. Silence at home was never a nice thing. It signaled conflict, a ready-made quarrel waiting to explode. This was calm. I meandered throughout the house, observing the framed pictures on the walls, the gentle buzz of the old grandfather clock in the corridor, the faint lavender aroma clinging to the draperies. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. I curled up on the couch, surfing through my phone to divert myself, but the weight of all that had happened the preceding few days pressed down on me. Before I knew it, I was writing a post online describing what had happened, not for pity, but only to clear things from my system. Peace never lasted long. That afternoon, as the sun sank low in the sky and bathed the room in a warm orange glow, my phone buzzed. The narrative fell naked and unvarnished, and once it was written, I laid my phone down and tried to concentrate on the mindless talk of the TV. I first ignored it, but it buzzed constantly until I grudgingly grabbed it. My mother sent me a text, the first I had heard from her since Dad, and she dropped me off at Aunt Margie's. It was brief, straightforward, ice cold. We had to talk. My immediate reaction was to chuck the phone across the room. They intended to chat. Now, after uprooting me, lying to Aunt Margie and acting like I'd want this. But curiosity overcame me, so I quickly typed back. About what? My blood started to boil from the barrage of books that followed. Mom was not getting in touch to ask questions or offer apologies. No, she was unhappy since some extended family members had seen my message and it was generating conflict. "How does this make us look?" she typed. "You have made the family ashamed." I read the words over and over, rage burning in my breast like a wildfire as they flashed on the screen. They kicked me out, lied to cover their tracks, and now I was the one creating problems? Fist clenched, I sat there staring at the texts until my eyesight clouded. I threw my phone on the couch without thinking, trying to force it all out of my thoughts. Aunt Margie could tell something was strange when she got home. She dropped her bag and glanced at me once, then her features softened with sympathy. "What is wrong?" she inquired, sitting next to me. First, I didn't want to dump all of my stuff on her. She had already done a great deal simply allowing me stay. But Aunt Margie made you feel protected, like nothing you said could ever drive her away. I thus told her about the books, explaining how my mother's concern about her reputation outweighed the reality of having me expelled. She nodded instead of saying something sympathetic, as I had expected her to do. "That sounds exactly like your mother," she replied. My mouth twitched to produce a sour smile at the corners. Aunt Margie understood it. She always had. "You don't owe them anything, you know," she whispered, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You are free to feel angry. You are free to put yourself first for once." It felt like a switch turned inside me. I had been trained all this time to believe that I had to accept whatever scraps of affection or attention my parents decided upon, but Aunt Margie was right. I owed not anything to them. It was they that had driven me away. Over the next few days, I blocked out calls and texts from my parents. For once, I had the power to decide what I wanted, and there was no guilt about it. I let myself concentrate on school, hanging out with friends who knew the foundations of what I was going through, but never encouraged me to talk more than I wanted to. Being in charge of my own space and time felt weird. Nobody hovering over me, no tension simmering just below the surface, just me, working things out at my own speed. Naturally, the peace never lasted. I saw my parents one afternoon as I was leaving the institution. My mother was waving at me from the entryway with her too bright smile, generally indicating she was attempting to act like everything was okay. My buddies gathered around me, creating a loose barrier. My dad stood next to her, arms crossed, eyes darting around like he wanted to be anywhere but here. They knew my story, or at least enough to know that I wanted no deal with this. My heart hammered, but I forced down the panic and headed toward them, keeping a safe distance. "What do you want?" My voice colder than I felt inside, I asked. Mom's smile wavered. "Julian, you have not been picking up our calls. We worry about you." Almost I laughed. Afraid? Now? After neglecting me for days and displaying more regard for their reputation than for my welfare? The absurdity of it hit me like a wave, and I couldn't stop the bitterness that slipped into my voice. "Now you're worried? After you kicked me out and lied to Aunt Margie?" Dad shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking up. "We didn't handle things well, okay? But you need to come home. Why ? Shot back. So you can pretend I don't exist while making everything about Vanessa and the baby? I'm not doing that again." Aunt Margie's warning must have been on their minds, because neither of them pushed as hard as they usually would. My mom's eyes welled up with tears, the same act she always played when she was attempting to guilt me. "We're your parents. We love you. We just want to fix things." "No," I said, my voice steady. "You want to make it look like everything's fine so you don't have to deal with what you did. But I'm not playing along this time." For a moment, silence stretched between us. My dad groaned and rested a hand on my mom's shoulder. He murmured, "Let's go," his voice subdued. She seemed like she wanted to fight, but after a long silence, she turned and headed toward the car, shoulders down. Dad followed, and I stayed there observing till they left. Though it was laced with melancholy too, my relief was intense and instantaneous. When I informed Aunt Margie what had happened when I arrived home, she nodded as if she expected it, no matter how many times I told myself they didn't care. "They'll try again. Remember, you don't have to go back." I nodded, the truth hitting in. Once more, I was free to say no. And that was a power I wasn't going to give up. Following that school confrontation, I felt things would at last calm down. Perhaps my parents would catch the clue and leave me alone, at least temporarily. I fell into a pattern that was shockingly really pleasant with Aunt Margie. We would have peaceful dinners, discuss our days, and occasionally find comfortable quietness with the TV running in background. But like always, the tranquility never lasts for long. One evening, Aunt Margie and I were sitting in the living room, her crocheting a new blanket while I turned through channels, trying to find something half-decent to see. The room felt like a safe refuge, as the lamp cast a comforting glow. As I began to unwind, someone knocked at the door. Aunt Margie and I looked at one another. She didn't have guests at night, and I most definitely wasn't expecting anyone. "You expecting someone?" she inquired, brow wrinkled. "No," I responded, already feeling a touch of anxiety. She got up and I trailed closely as she opened the door. And there were my parents. With her strained, too brilliant smile on her lips, my mom stood. My dad looked as uncomfortable as ever, hands pushed firmly deep into his pockets. My tummy turned over at the sight of them on Aunt Margie's porch. "Hi, Julian," my mother replied with a false warmth. "Could we come in?" Aunt Margie missed no beat at all. My mom's grin wavered and she sighed, her eyes flitting between me and Aunt Margie like she was looking for an ally. "I don't think that's a good idea," she replied, her voice stern but calm. "We only want to chat to him. Please." I steadied myself by crossing my arms and slanted against the door frame. "What conversation topic would be appropriate? You already made it clear where I stand." "Julian, it wasn't like that," my mother responded, her voice quivering with that false sensitivity she often employed. "We thought it was best for everyone." I laughed coldly and let it come through. "Best for everyone?" On my birthday, you kicked me off. For Vanessa's baby. My dad cleared his throat at last and stepped in. Okay, we did not handle it very properly, but you have to head home. Why? I took a quick picture. So I can return to being invisible? You can then continue to act as though I don't matter while Vanessa dominates everything. Aunt Margie moved slightly to make it very evident she was on my side, ready to call off this if it grew more violent. Her voice steady. I think it's best if you leave now, she said. My mom's eyes filled with tears, the same act she always performed when things weren't going her way. Julian, you are your parents. We appreciate you. We want things right. I looked at her, the weight of her comments settling into me like stones. They wanted nothing fixed for me, for their own comfort, not mine. They wanted to smooth things up so they could pretend everything was good. You had chances to fix things, I continued, my voice low and level. But each time you selected Vanessa. Act not as you presently do. The silence that followed was dense and weighty. Looking down, my dad sighed and then pushed her shoulder. She opened her mouth as though she were arguing, but after a while she merely nodded, tears still in her eyes. Without further word, they turned and headed back toward the car. Closing the door and locking it, Aunt Margie turned to glance at me with a little sad grin. You fine? She asked. I nodded, though my chest felt constricted. Describing the mixture of grief and relief that enveloped me proved difficult. Later that evening, as I sat in the dark room, my phone buzzed. I was happy I had kept my ground, that Aunt Margie had my back, but it made it much more terrible to know that my own parents would pick anyone but me every single time. I virtually turned away from it, but something caught my eye on the television. Vanessa sent me this SMS. They shared with me what transpired. I'm sorry they attempted to get you back in. That hit different. I see why you would not want to come home. Vanessa had always been the star, the one attracting all the attention, but here she was, expressing understanding. And then still another message surfaced. I sat back reading the words over and again until they blurred. You deserve to stand up for yourself. That was not what I expected. I noticed her differently for the first time, slightly changed. Perhaps she participated less in the issue than I had assumed. I shrugged, trying to seem cool, but deep down I felt it too. I showed Aunt Margie the books and she nodded, saying, You've come a long way. Her voice soft with pride. Not the same child that had been thrown out like the headlines from yesterday. That felt like something. I was stronger now, learning to stand up for myself, and the next morning sunlight warmed the room through the window. I stretched, exhaling the breath I had not noticed I had been holding. The house was still and quiet, not weighted down by expectations or attempting to fit into a place where I wasn't welcome. I felt free, first in a long time. A few days following my parents' sudden visit, things seemed to settle back into a peculiar sort of normal. Just me, in a place I was finally noticed. Quiet breakfasts, shared stories, and evenings spent viewing shows that made us laugh until we could not breathe returned Aunt Margie and I to our customary routine. One afternoon, as I sat on the rear porch with a book in hand, my phone buzzed. It was the most calm I had in years, but I knew better than to believe it would continue forever. I hesitated, then grabbed it, half expecting another guilt-laden message from my mother. But once more it was Vanessa. Her brief but forceful message was, Can we get together? Only ourselves. I have to talk. I looked at the screen for some time trying to figure out how I felt about it. Though she hadn't specifically been an ally in my life, Vanessa hadn't been part of the direct damage either. Never stopping to observe how it left me in the shadows, she coasted on the tsunami of attention and compliments our parents bestowed on her. But something in her last note, expressing pride in me, stayed with me. Perhaps it was time to listen to her. I texted back, sure. The downtown cafe? Fantastic. When I told Aunt Margie where I was heading, she gave me a look that was part caution, part encouragement. She answered nearly immediately at 4. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, Julian, she reminded me. I know, I responded, controlling a little smile. But I think I need to hear her out. The cafe was a modest spot on Main Street, pleasant and familiar with the aroma of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries hanging in the air. When I entered, Vanessa was seated at the window, tapping frantically on the table with her fingers. She appeared different, worn out and fatigued, not the polished, self-assured sister I knew. "Hey," I began as I sat down. She repeated, her voice quieter than normal. We sat there for a moment, not sure how to get going. At last, Vanessa inhaled and dove in. "I apologize, Julian, for all." I observed her trying to interpret her expression. "I should have done more and spoken up when Mom and Dad kicked you out." Seeing her so erratic was unusual. "Why now?" I questioned. "Why, after everything, do you care now?" Her lips bit, her eyes shining. "Because I see it right now. Keeping my head down and making them happy seemed like the right thing to be doing. But I was incorrect. When I came over your message and discovered how much they misled you, how much damage did they do?" She turned away, fixed on the street outside. "It hit me. And just now, I am likewise caught. They want to rule every aspect of my life, including the baby." Hearing her say that felt like someone had turned on a switch. I am suffocating. For so long, I considered her as the one with it all, that is, the one free from the weight of our parents' expectations as I experienced. But I could now see holes in her armor. I said, my voice low, "I didn't know," underscoring the pressure she had been under and her own captivity. "I considered you to be..." She nodded, a sad smile pulling at her lips. "I don't know. Part of their world, not mine." I thought so too. "I am working to reverse it now, though. Ryan will be moving out with me." There was a long stillness broken by the commotion of the cafe. I do not want them to have that type of influence over my life or that of my child. This change of viewpoint was weird. Vanessa was not the opponent I had developed in my mind. She was exactly as caught in the web of our parents as I had been. She was now, like me, struggling to get free. "I'm glad you're doing that," I murmured at last. Though I understand now, I do not think I could forgive anything right immediately. Relief flooded her face, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were seeing one other clearly. "I'm not crazy at you anymore. Absence of rivalry and no bitterness. Just siblings trapped in the same storm." We spoke, actually, for the next hour. Regarding the baby, about what it was like growing up in our house, about how neither of us ever really felt good enough, just in different ways. It was like removing layers to find items we had buried years ago. Vanessa hugged me when we at last got up to leave. It seemed real, like a bridge built over ancient hostile waters. When I arrived back to Aunt Margie's, she was in the kitchen cooking dinner. Her eyes lifted in silent inquiry as I entered. "It went better than I thought," I replied, placing down my suitcase and slinking against the counter. We did indeed have a conversation, really spoke. The face of Aunt Margie softened to smile. "That's great, Julian. Sometimes the most unlikely locations yield understanding." I nodded, feeling lighter than I have in weeks. Indeed, this may be a beginning. The next days felt different. Vanessa and I texted each other, nothing significant but little check-ins. Though not ideal, it was something. And for once, I felt as though the bits of my existence were not random shards. Though the past has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, they were beginning to gather piece by bit. The phone rang one evening while Aunt Margie and I were clearing after supper. She added, "It's your dad," holding the phone out to me. Her tone changed from laid back to serious as she listened. I stopped, my pulse thumping in my chest. Since that day on the porch, I had not talked to him. I inhaled steadily and grabbed the phone. "Hi there." "Julian." My dad's voice was strained and lacked the love that ought to come from a parent speaking to his son. "We have to talk about what?" My hands were shaking, but my voice remained calm. There was a pause, heavy with unsung words. "Things are complex here. We know we made mistakes. Your mother and I have been talking about this. We want things right." I wanted to believe him. Some of me, the part still a child yearning for his parents' approval, wanted to embrace the notion that they could evolve. But better knowledge came from the older, warier side of me. "You want to write things since Vanessa is leaving?" I asked, not trying to soften the charge. Silence, and that silence was sufficient. "I'm not coming back," I said with a clear, unbroken voice. "You need to figure this out without me." The talk ended soon after, his sigh resounding in my ear as I returned the phone to Aunt Margie. She watched me, waiting to see how I would respond. "I'm done," I told her, more to me than to her. And for once, I felt like I meant it. The days following Dad's call were slower than I had anticipated. I imagined more texts, more efforts, maybe even another surprise visit at Aunt Margie's door. But nothing existed. Simply quiet. It felt odd, like standing in the eye of a storm, not knowing when or if the winds would resume. Vanessa and I stayed in touch. I wasn't sure if that was a positive thing or if something worse was simmering. As promised, she and Ryan were moving out and located a tiny apartment on the other side of town. She emailed me revisions, pictures of her packing boxes, or images of the small nursery she was building. Being somewhere where we could talk and share things free from the heavy shadow of our parents felt strange, almost surreal. One afternoon, Aunt Margie came into the living room where I was sprawled out with a book. There was still so much between us that needed untangling, but for the first time it seemed feasible. She looked that way, the one indicating she was thinking deeply but not sure how to start. Her voice was gentle when she said, "I heard from your mom." She tensed, but nodded for her to continue. "She says they are seeing counselors. Your dad didn't want to at first, but I guess the idea of losing both of you pushed them." She paused, studying my face. "They're trying, Julian. I don't know if it'll stick, but I thought you should know." It was a lot to take in. The idea of them actually working on themselves, trying to change, was something I hadn't even let myself imagine. Part of me wanted to scoff, to dismiss it as another one of their attempts to make themselves look good. But another part of me, buried deep under the layers of hurt and disappointment, wanted to believe it. Not for them, but for the part of me that still wanted to hope. "Thanks for telling me," I said finally, looking back at my book, even though I wasn't reading it anymore. Aunt Margie gave me a nod, the kind that said she understood even without me saying anything else. A week passed, and then another. School became my anchor, my friends making sure I stayed grounded and reminding me that there was life outside of my parents' drama. I hung out more, laughed more, and started feeling like I wasn't just existing anymore. I was living. Vanessa texted one evening, a simple, "Can I come by?" When she arrived, she looked different, a mix of tired and relieved. She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted you to know I moved out. Ryan and I are officially in our own place now." I smiled, genuinely happy for her. "That's good, Vanessa. Really good. She nodded, and there was a moment of silence, both of us soaking in how far things had come. "Mom and Dad are trying," she said. "It's weird. They keep asking me to come by, but I'm taking a break from them too. I just need space. "Yeah," I said, understanding the need for that distance more than she probably knew. "It's about time we both got some space." Vanessa reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it, Julian. To really see you, it wasn't a full repair, but it was a start." "We're getting there," I said, a small smile forming on my lips. After Vanessa left, Aunt Margie came into the room, a knowing look in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I quote am okay," I said, and this time I really meant it. A few days later, I got an unexpected call. It was from my grandparents, the ones with the money and the influence, the ones my parents had been so afraid of upsetting. They'd heard everything, somehow piecing together the bits that had trickled through the family gossip. My grandmother's voice was steady and strong as she spoke. "Julian, we're sorry for what happened. We didn't know it was so bad." "I appreciate that," I said, not knowing what else to say. It was strange hearing remorse from people who were usually detached from the mess. "We'd like to see you," she said after a pause, "if that's something you'd want." I looked around Aunt Margie's house, the place that had become my safe haven, and then glanced out the window where the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows. "Maybe," I said, realizing that I could decide on my own terms. "But not right now. That's fair," she replied, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost proud. Life started to find a new kind of rhythm after that. Aunt Margie kept being her amazing self, always there when I needed her but never pushing. School kept me busy, and my friends kept me grounded. Vanessa and I talked regularly, learning how to be siblings again without the competition and tension that used to define us. One evening, as the sky turned from blue to deep indigo, Aunt Margie and I sat on the back porch, sipping on lemonade and watching the stars begin to peek through. She looked at me with that gentle smile of hers and said, "You know, you've come a long way." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I have." And for the first time in a long while, I felt it. The weight of everything, the hurt, the anger, the constant feeling of not being enough, was still there, but it was lighter, manageable. I knew there would be days when it came back full force, when the memories would sting and the doubt would creep in. But for now, I had a place where I was wanted and where I was seen. I had a sister who was trying, an aunt who had my back, and the realization that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket, and as I looked up at the stars, I finally felt at peace. Maybe things weren't perfect, and maybe they never would be, but for the first time, that was okay, because I knew who I was, and I knew I deserved better. And that, more than anything, was enough.